This is 9/11 Freefall.
Episode of 9/11 Freefall. I'm your host, Andy Steele, and the guest tonight is Craig Mckee. He's the great writer behind the Truth and Shadows blog. They cover a lot of 9/11 truth issues and other stuff related to 9/11 truth there too, and we're going to be picking up on the discussion we started the last time he was on the show, talking about the media and its relationship with 9/11 truth and the scientific evidence proving that buildings 1, 2, and 7 of the World Trade Center complex were in fact brought down in controlled demolitions on 9/11. And Craig should know something about this because he's a part of the mainstream media. He's won many awards as a journalist, and he's continuing on his work as a journalist talking about this issue. I love having him on too. He's got a great sense of humor, so I know you guys are going to enjoy it too. So I'm going to be playing that interview for you in just a few minutes. I myself, just a quick personal update, I'm coming back down from a flu, or back up from a flu, however you want to describe it. So if I sound a little out of my game tonight, or if I sound that way in the interview, actually when I did the interview with Craig, I was starting to have the flu, and then I fought it out afterwards, and now, like I said, I'm coming back down from it. But everybody I know in the Northeast is sick right now, and it's just been a bad winter for that. So stay safe, stay healthy out there, and take care of yourself, man, because when your health is not working right, you are not working right. And believe me, I know. All right, I'm going to play you a clip. This is from another show. The show, I believe, is called Tragedy and Hope. The full title of the interview is The Future of Freedom, a feature interview with NSA whistleblower William Binney. And if you remember, William Binney is a former NSA technical director who many months ago signed the petition at ae911truth.org demanding a real investigation into the destruction of the 3 towers that fell in New York on 9/11. And we broke that here on this show, I'm proud to say. And he's still talking about it. He was asked about 9/11 in this interview, and he starts off from an official story perspective, talking about how the surveillance was misused and wasn't used right to try to catch the hijackers. But then he brings up AE911 Truth. Even though he doesn't mention them by name, the group of physicists and scientists that he mentions obviously is them. And I want you to hear this excerpt from this interview. So I'm going to play that for you right now.
On the airplane simultaneously. So you could see that buildup. That was an obvious attack coming.
What are some of the things about 9/11, 13 years later, that disturb you, that might not have been investigated properly? Or what are some of the anomalies or things that, are like a splinter in your mind about 9/11?
Well, in the intelligence arena, there's, of course, the inadequate search of the database that NSA did. And after the fact, they found the data and then covering it up and not letting it be exposed to the congressional investigations or the 9/11 Commission, to my knowledge anyway. So that meant that they didn't have those aspects to deal with and couldn't deal with it in terms of their reports or in their studies. And so, and then there's the physical issues. I've been talking to some physicists recently and engineers and so on, and they have a coalition of people, the 9/11 Truth Group, which is saying there are certain aspects of 9/11, the physical nature of how the things occurred, that should have been addressed by these different studies, and have not been physical things, observable acts like molten metal in the buildings, coming out of the buildings, and like the certain temperatures physics require certain temperatures for that to occur, and how you can't get that kind of temperature in a fire in a building like that.
So you can't identify the source of what's causing that.
Right, but that's a physical fact that should have been addressed and dealt with, and also Building 7 falling straight on its footprint, that kind of thing is suspicious. How could a building like that fall that way? And that was not even addressed. So none of those things, or some of the other things they were showing me, were also suspicious that they should have addressed, and they didn't. And so none of the studies came out with those. So that's basically a very bad. Even NIST didn't do that. I mean, that's not good science at all. I mean, you don't ignore facts that don't fit your preconceived outcome. In other words, if I wanted to solve a crypt problem and I had a preconceived idea of how it went there, and any fact that came along about that system that didn't fit my preconceived idea, I threw them away, I would always fail. Never solve any of them.
I couldn't say it better myself, folks, and William Binney stands as a great example of why it's important to refine the message, stick to what you can prove, and just argue from a common sense perspective. Former NSA technical director, he's a guy who deals with hard facts. And what got him to sign the petition was the hard facts. The observable facts were ignored by NIST, by the 9/11 Commission. Okay? So, again, stick to the science, because that is what's going to open people's eyes, and that is going to be what gets people like William Binney to bring this up in other interviews, all right? And also reach out to as many people as you can, because you have no idea who you are reaching. If you come across somebody that you think is interesting, that you think may have an open mind to this information, talk to them. Send them some information. If you need any advice, contact me, Steele at ae911truth.org. I'll help you out and tell you what the best way to do it from my own perspective is. But just keep on speaking, keep on reaching out to whoever you can, because you're striking gold just by opening your mouth. All right, what we're going to do now is what we do every week. We're going to take 10 seconds of silence to remember the victims of 9/11 and their families and all the people who died in the wars that followed 9/11. We're going to do that beginning now. And that is 10 seconds. Craig Mckee has been a journalist in Montreal for 23 years, covering news and entertainment. He's won 8 provincial and national weekly newspaper awards. He's also a member of AE 9/11 Truth's writing team. His blog, which covers 9/11 Truth and other issues, is called Truth and Shadows, a great site to check out. Craig, welcome back to 9/11 Freefall.
Thanks very much, Andy. Glad to be here.
Now, for those who didn't hear you the first time you were on this show, can you briefly tell our audience a little bit more about yourself and your history before coming into this fight that we're in?
Sure. Well, as far as my background as a journalist, you covered it pretty well there. I've been in journalism in one way or another for actually, I think my bio on my site says 23 years, but I think I haven't updated that in a while, so I think it's probably more than that now. But yeah, I worked for weekly papers doing news reporting, entertainment, editing and various things for a number of years. And I guess I can sort of tell you how I got involved in 9/11 Truth. It happened about 2007, I think it was, when I first started to become aware of what was going on, what had gone on with Building 7. I was completely unaware of that before, which in retrospect I find I can't quite believe, but I was unaware. And that was the beginning, because my first reaction when I heard about it was that it couldn't possibly be true, because we would have been told by the media. And of course, that's when I had a much more naive, I guess, and idealistic idea of how the mainstream media worked. I was in the mainstream media, although not at the highest levels, but that was kind of the beginning of a complete, transformation for me, because once I started to realize that, something so important was being ignored, at best ignored and at worst suppressed by the media, and that couldn't be accidental. It's not as if people didn't know that this had happened. It's not a story that flew under the radar, and so that was kind of the beginning. And then I started from there look into the whole thing with the towers, and I actually, it's funny, I don't think I told you this last time I was on, but I was taking a theater course actually back in maybe, I don't know, 07 or 08 at night, and we had to come up with a one person sort of a monologue thing to perform, and I ended up doing mine sort of because I created a character who was a 9/11 truth person, and I had to sort of put it in a dramatic thing, but basically making my case, I guess, for why the whole thing was a fraud. And I don't know how theatrical it was, but it was kind of, I guess it indicated that I was onto this, and I was pretty fascinated by it, and so ever since then, once I started the blog in 2010, and that was just because that was when I sort of was able to do it, and so I've been doing it ever since, and involved with A&E, which has been great for the last year or so, and writing articles for them, and so that's where I am today.
Right, and we're keeping at it. And what you say about including all of this information, the 9/11 science truth information, in your dramatic monologue for a theater class is the kind of creative stuff that people need to do, the kind of stuff that I like to see people undertaking. You have an article up on your website right now. It's also there's also an article about it at ae911truth.org about an artist getting a picture, a painting, into a museum that talks about 9/11 truth information, and that is an amazing thing. And one of the great things about art and literature, the reason that we study these things, is because you get something from them. You get an idea of what's going on in society at the time that these artists lived. And to include this issue raises its importance in the minds of the public and really brings it to people who may never even heard of it before. Now, you've covered a lot about the movement. A lot of your articles, as I stated before, are about 9/11 truth, and even if you diverge from 9/11 truth, it's not really that far from it, because there's a lot of issues that 9/11 truth lies at the base of. What do you think the biggest challenge for the movement is right now?
Wow, that's a big question, and a good question, and it's one that I hear truthers asking themselves all the time. Like I'm involved in the 9/11 Truth teleconference group, which is a monthly conference call where we discuss issues that are related to 9/11, obviously, and sometimes have guests on who will talk about some area of their research. And recently we've been talking about whether the focus strictly on 9/11 is still the way to go after all these years, or whether we should broaden it so that we bring in issues that are actually quite related to 9/11, as you pointed out. This could include, it could include anything, but it could include false flag events that happen now. We've seen a few attacks, in quotation marks, that have been pinned on Muslim extremists recently that have a lot of questions about them, and they, in many ways, appear to be quite suspicious, if not clearly false flags. And those kinds of things you can't really separate those from 9/11, because 9/11 was the big one, and that was clearly intended to create incredible fear, but also to focus our attention on an enemy that we are all supposed to fear, and we're all supposed to give away our rights and our power to the powers that be, so that they can go ahead and start more wars and increase surveillance and militarize the police further and all this sorts of stuff. So anyway, we're going to have that discussion, I guess, in that group. And so, because for the very reason that a lot of people are sort of wondering, what do we just focus narrowly on 9/11, or do we bring other things in? I mean, I always thought 9/11 was the best way to break through with people, and it's what I continue to do when I'm talking to people and I'm trying to open their eyes a little bit. To the extent that they will put up with it, I will look at 9/11. A lot of people, they kind of go, "Oh yeah, I don't want to hear about that." So sometimes it's a hard sell, but to me, it's such a clear-cut case of a mammoth deception that it seems like a great way to kind of wedge the door open a little bit and to get people to look at it. The smaller stuff, even if you can show people that there are anomalies with the smaller events, they may not see that as being a world-altering kind of thing. Whereas 9/11, there's no question about what that has done. I mean, the war on terror has been the focus of our Western leaders ever since 9/11, and with all these false flags or potential false flags, I guess, that we've seen in the last couple of years, it seems that they're even ramping things up even more with more and more legislation. In Canada, where there's going to be a bill presented in Parliament, I think it's this week, that's going to give further power to the police and the security agencies to deal with terrorism. And the Prime Minister, our Prime Minister Stephen Harper, he's telling everybody that we need to give the police the tools so they can fight terrorism. And the fact is, they've got all the tools they need to deal with legitimate threats. But this is just another power grab, another way to take more power away from the population and to control us even further. And it's certainly, if these events aren't false flags, and I'm thinking of the one in Paris, the one in Ottawa, and the one in Sydney, if they're not, then they're really coincidentally convenient for these Western governments, because they're just coming along just at the right time to encourage the population to support these tougher laws. I mean, in France, they were looking at legislation right at the time of the Charlie Hebdo thing. So it seems awfully convenient, that's for sure.
Thinking about all this, I'll tell a quick story. When I was in the Peace Corps, I was a teacher in Uzbekistan of little kids. Little kids to big kids, but a lot of little kids. And what they would do, they used to have to give the kids shots, some kind of inoculation each year, but rather than sending them down to the nurse, like we might do here in the United States, the nurse would actually come to the classroom and be giving it to the kids in the corner of the room. So you can imagine this made teaching very difficult, because children would be getting shots in the corner of the room. And even though I'm trying to do something fun, play a game up there to learn the English, you could see it on their faces. They're trying to pay attention to the game, but then they're looking at the other kid who's crying in the corner getting a shot, and they know it's coming to them very soon. So it was very difficult to try to basically get them to learn anything that day, because you can see the terror on their faces. Now apply that to our current situation. Here you are doing your thing on your blog, and here, AE 9/11 Truth, talking about free fall, nanothermite in the dust, all of these scientific concepts, and the public is getting all of these new events popping up. They're being reminded by the government that they need to be afraid over and over again. And unfortunately, just, with all the work I do with 9/11 Truth, I can't look at these events very closely. And plus, I don't really talk about them very much on this show, because the focus is 9/11 Science Truth. But people should always question what's going on. People should always be vigilant about the story that they are being handed. And one of the greatest things I think we've done in this movement is we have made people more vigilant. We've made them ask those questions at the very beginning, much to the chagrin of the quote-unquote mainstream media. I don't really consider them mainstream anymore, but just so that we can all identify the beast here, we'll call it that. Or
the corporate media, you could call them.
Yeah, the corporate media. there was a concerted effort right from the very beginning to keep this covered up. And why can I say that with certainty? You know, I was just on a show, John B. Wells' program, and he asked me the biggest example of media censorship that I've seen, and I had to cite this. After 9/11, in the year 2002, right before there was a 9/11 truth movement, really, I mean, when it was basically maybe 5 guys and their 20 listeners, that was 9/11 truth. Now, there might have been bigger numbers, but really nobody had been seriously considering this at that point. There was a movie that came out on HBO called In Memoriam, and it's got Rudy Giuliani narrating certain parts, and then other parts are just videos from the street showing just what was going on that day. And there's a scene where there are firefighters on a payphone, and one of them says something like, "I'm right under the thing, but I'm okay. You want to talk to this guy? Let him know he'll let you know I'm okay." Now the movie In Memoriam cut it off at that point, but if you actually play out the full video, because it's available on YouTube, the full video of this. At that moment, as he hands the phone to the other firefighter, there's an explosion. It's like 2 explosions. Boom, boom. And then another firefighter says something to the extent like 7 is exploding, right? Now, I don't care how somber the event is. If you are putting together something like this, you're going to want to have that excitement. You're going to want to capture the moment. But they made that decision to pull that. And again, this was long before there was really a movement, groups talking about Building 7. So it shows they did not want the explosions to be heard in that film. Now, I don't know if you've seen that example of that, but from your experience, I understand, I'm not sure how much working in television you've done, but just through editing, how could you hypothesize that kind of decision gets made? I mean, could there be a quote-unquote conspiracy reaching down to the editors of this film on HBO? How can something like that happen just a year after the event took place?
Well, that's a good question. I haven't worked in television, but I think it's a similar question that you could ask about print journalism. You know, I mean, if a news editor for a paper wants you to not go down a certain road, are they doing it because they know that this has got to be suppressed, or are they doing it because they have a feeling that this could be dicey area and they don't want to take any chances? They don't want to take any risks with their job. I try to figure this out all the time. I think back to when I was working for a weekly paper in Montreal. It's the largest one in terms of circulation, and I was working in the news department at the time, and they gave us the opportunity to write editorials or op-ed pieces from time to time. So I wanted to write one about the CIA overthrow of the Iranian government in 1953, because that's so, and this is long before I was even interested in, I even was into 9/11 truth. This is before that. Because, I mean, the implications or the ramifications of that overthrow are obvious. You just sort of look at what has happened in the Middle East since and what has happened with Iran since. And my boss, the editor of the paper, I mean, this is not a big city daily where there are hundreds of people. This is a small newsroom. And, you know, he completely went off on me. Like, he just was like yelling at me. Now, that's partly because that was his, you know, personality. He was kind of a crazy person, but it was like just the fact that I was talking about something that was not, he didn't think of as being a mainstream perspective. It's just like it set off alarm bells in his head, and he just like didn't want to go there. Now, did he think that he wasn't supposed to go there, or was it just kind of something that was subconscious? It's really hard to know. I mean, I don't think anybody told him from above, make sure you don't write anything about Iran. I don't think that was the case. But, it's a combination of, I think in some cases it's a case of the editor or whoever it is, to get to a certain place where they have decision-making power of some significance, they have to have already kind of played the game to get to that position. So, they may not even be conscious that they are suppressing something. Although in the example you gave, that seems pretty hard to imagine, but they may have seen that footage and they may have not understood the implications of it, and so they didn't want to take a chance that they were presenting something that they didn't really have an explanation for. It also may have just been it didn't fit the narrative that they wanted to tell in that. They wanted to tell an emotional story, which is so often what the mainstream media does. They avoid all of these implications by looking at the human element and the heroism of some of the rescuers, or the tragic stories of some of the victims. It seems like that's the way the mainstream media likes to go to avoid giving us any kind of context or explaining anything. If they can just deal with it on an emotional level, the audience is very taken with that, and that's really obvious. I mean, one of the posts that I had on the blog a month or two ago was written by Barry Zwicker, and it was all about the Ottawa Parliament shooting in October. And it was a really good article, a really in-depth article. And a friend of mine, an acquaintance of mine, reacted to this thing being posted on Facebook, and he said, "This is bullshit," and excuse my language. And not only that, but it's offensive, with 4 exclamation points. And I just thought, well, that's the kind of person that's ideal. That's what the mainstream media is looking for. People that will react to these things on an emotional level. It's not offensive because it's incorrect, because I don't think he even read the article. It was just the implication of it was offensive to him. So I don't know if I've really answered your question, but I think it's, in some cases, it's definitely got to be conscious. There's no question about it. Certainly the higher you go.
Right, and the firefighters, I mean, again, that captures the essence in the human drama there. They're scared, they're hearing an explosion, one of them says, "We got to get out of here," something to that effect. So, I mean, I believe it has to be conscious. I can confidently say that someone said, we don't want those explosions in there. But what you said about people reacting emotionally, when you go to the YouTube posting of this video, because again, it was on HBO, but somebody grabbed it and put it up on YouTube. I actually left a comment, not saying 9/11 was an inside job or anything like that. I just pointed out very factually that they cut this video, and then gave a link to the original footage, the full footage, and the person deleted it. And even before that, I knew they would delete it because it said something about remembering how he felt that day. And all of his other comments and responding to people were talking about the 9/11 conspiracy theorists and how they hate America and all of this stuff. And you hear people, I remember Glenn Beck saying this, you need to remember how we felt on 9/12. Well, on 9/12, everybody was bloodthirsty and emotional and looking to turn Afghanistan into a parking lot. People got their chests out, and that was a big thing you always heard: nuke Afghanistan, turn it into a parking lot. People feel like they're tough coming out and saying these things. But so is that the way we want America to be perpetually? That we just completely abandon our critical thinking? Something too, I've said this before, that the establishment has done. They've done a very expert job at it. They were at this even before we had a 9/11 truth movement and got our stuff together, is that they attached themselves, they piggybacked the American foreign policy agenda post 9/11 onto the heroism of the first responders that day. They essentially took these people who were horribly traumatized, took them from this horrible situation, led them by the hand, and stuck a trophy in their arms. And I'm not saying that the first responders shouldn't be honored for what they did that day. I mean, it was a terrifying experience. I've told the story of the firefighter on TV that I saw who knew he was going to die when he was going back into the into the building after the first tower had come down. So certainly they should be celebrated, but they associated it with America. There was always this attempt to throw a flag in the background and get politicians, Bush and Giuliani and these folks standing with them and talking about how, we're going to get those people who knock these buildings down. And so you mix in the very real heroism of these first responders with the fake heroism of these politicians who just show up afterwards and then just give orders for other people's children to go fight in these wars for them. And so now when you question 9/11 and you question, how much people these politicians may have known, how much they're covering up now, they've mixed it all together so well that these firefighters and people who respect the firefighters think that you're attacking them, that you're attacking their heroism. And I don't know what you do about that. It's just the way it is. It's just you have to appeal to people's critical thinking skills and somehow separate all of that when you're talking to them.
Yeah, and we've also got to let people know that the way to honor anybody that was a victim of 9/11, whether it was people that were just in the buildings or first responders or rescue workers who have died since from breathing the air, whatever it is that the only way or the best way to really honor the loss that those people and their families have suffered is to find the truth. And, we can't let this be characterized as we just don't care about the victims, or we don't care about traumatizing the victims' families further by questioning this. And we can't let people forget that a lot of the people doing the questioning are victims' family members. But that's again, that's very difficult when the mainstream media is reporting it only one way. It's really hard to get that message out. It's hard to compete with CNN and Fox and all these, because so many people just rely on that. They just accept it as being the full story. So it's a real uphill battle that we have.
Now, I'm going to give you another one of these tough but good questions here, very broad. Where do you think we've succeeded as a movement, and what do you think that we in the movement need to improve?
That is a good question. I think one thing that we've let me just think here for a second. I was going to say that the recent events that are not 9/11 directly, but we were talking about earlier, that seem to be following the same agenda of creating fear of Muslims, fear of terrorism, and all this. I think more and more people are becoming, through, at least in part, our efforts, are becoming aware of just the very concept of what is a false flag operation. What does that mean? People actually know what that term means more than I think they ever have in the past. And I think that's thanks to the internet and the fact that we have the ability to reach each other and bypass the mainstream media much more than we ever could before. So I think that's one thing that the movement has done well, but the movement and all the sort of extensions of the movement, because a lot of people in the movement, as you pointed out earlier, are not necessarily only dealing with 9/11 all the time. They may have their focus on 9/11, but they're keeping in mind that other events are in the same context and are part of the same agenda. So I think that's one thing that, I don't know if you could say we did it well, but it certainly has been a positive development, although there have been so many of these false flags in the last 2 or 3 years that you could say, well, we're more aware of them, but there's also more and more of them happening. Now, where do we need improvement? Yeah, that's a really good question. My belief has always been that, sometimes I think the movement, we in the movement are our own worst enemies sometimes. And I think the thing that I think people need to do is they need to make a complete case for why 9/11 was an inside job. They need to because when I was convinced, it wasn't one thing that convinced me. It was one thing that got me started looking into it. But once I looked into Building 7, and then I started looking at the towers, and I started looking at the Pentagon, and then Shanksville, it was the complete totality of it that made me think, oh my God, it's so obviously a deception. So I think that it's important for us to keep that in mind. And I think a lot of people want to kind of go for just one thing. And I think it's fine for I think it's fine for a particular organization to focus on one thing. But I think as a movement overall, we have to show people all the evidence, because when you add it all together, it's overwhelming. So I think we need to do better at that. And I think the thing that I think we've always needed to do better at, and maybe there are some hopeful signs in recent years, is sort of public outreach type things. And we've seen some positive stuff with billboard campaigns that AE's been involved in, and the Times Square billboard, that's kind of an attention grabber. And I think it just letting people know that we're still around. A lot of people kind of think, oh yeah, there were these conspiracy theorists, and they kind of assume that it's kind of an oddball thing that's going to fade away. But I think the more we let them know that we're still here and we're still fighting for this, and we're not going anywhere, then I think maybe slowly over time people will be more willing to take a look at it. So.
That's right, and we need more activists. It's very tempting, especially 13 years after the event happened, to keep it confined to this mental bunker on the internet where people are just chatting with each other and realizing Building 7, Twin Towers were controlled demolitions, and kind of just sitting on a hill or in an ivory tower feeling, oh, well, I'm smarter than everybody else because I know this, and just looking at the rest of the world like it's your enemy and staying there. And I want people, personally, if I could have my way suddenly, to take it away from the internet and take it into the real world, because if it's just confined on the internet, that's the only place it's going to stay. And then the pundits on TV can just go on demonizing the internet and things will never change. So take that energy that you are using to argue on the internet with trolls and write a letter to your congressman, or if you don't think your congressman's going to do anything, write to somebody else influential. There's lots of people out there in the world who may not be a congressman or a media person, but still may have some authority in terms of public opinion of this person, or people that they know. It could be your favorite professor, or just somebody who did something in the past, somebody who used to be a journalist. Maybe you find an article about something that covered an issue like the one Craig was talking about, for instance, the overthrow of the Iranian government. Now, if Craig could get that published, maybe 20 years ago, let's say, one might come across that article and say, who is this Craig Mckee fellow? What's he doing right now? And if Craig hadn't woken up to 9/11 yet, they might see that he's doing something else and write to him and send him the information, and he might be more open to it. So there could be articles that you read from 30 years ago. The guy could still be alive and his mind is already open to this stuff. And even though he's not necessarily a journalist now, or he might be retired, he might be able to help out in some way. Who knows? He might know people who are journalists now, know how the system works. So going through your media and going through the government aren't the only steps. If you are talking, you are winning. And so, yeah, I'd love to see us take that energy from the internet and put it into the real world. The torture report came out. I talked about it on the Christmas show. Yeah, we spent the Christmas show talking about torture. And I think it's important because it branches off from 9/11. It's one of these issues that you really can't justify it except with the mention of September 11th and never again. And I've heard very nice people who are good people, justify this torture because they think it gets good intelligence, even though it doesn't, and they want to prevent another 9/11 from happening. So, as a Canadian, first, tell us what your take is on the torture report, and what this has to do with 9/11 truth from your own perspective.
Sure. Well, I think one of the things is that obviously a lot of the government has basically admitted that a lot of the testimony that they've had related to 9/11 was obtained through torture. And I think David Long made that point when he was on your program a while back. So it kind of reopens that whole side of the discussion. But also the thing that strikes me too about just whenever something gets really widespread coverage in the mainstream media, first thing I always think about is why. Why is this considered okay to cover? And I guess that's the thing that occurs to me is that the reason why this is not suppressed is because the whole idea of torture sort of plays into the whole terrorist scenario. If people are focused on that the government shouldn't be torturing people, which of course it shouldn't, but if people are focused on that, they're probably buying into the idea that, well, we have this terrorist threat that we have to decide how to deal with it. Do we torture people, or do we risk not getting the information by not torturing them? And so having that whole discussion, no matter how bad it might make the government look because of how bad their behavior is, it still plays into this whole paradigm, the whole terrorist versus us paradigm. So, I think that's where it's kind of damaging. But it's the extent that it gets people questioning, I guess. One would hope that it would get some people questioning. But I'm just not very confident that the mainstream media would give us the kind of context that we would need to question whether this, I guess, changes how we see 9/11. So I guess I'm sort of skeptical about the positives about this all coming out, just for the reason that I just gave. But what do you think?
Well, what you said actually put that thought into my mind now about whether or not it's even good to be debating the merits of torture, because it throws out the fact that 9/11, the basis for which they justify this, we've been lied to about it. It was a controlled demolition that we saw in New York that day. And so when you give it credence and turn it into a debate about whether or not it gets good intelligence and is useful, I see your point there. What I see as the mainstream media's job is to sell people agendas. And people will say to me, well, but they present the other side. They'll get somebody on there who will argue against torture on there. But it's fascinating to me. When I'm bored, sometimes I watch lectures from different universities, and I was watching one on psychology. And I don't even remember what this lecture series was called, but it was a very cool and funny professor. And he said something about how it's been proven through studies that you are more apt to fall in love with somebody that you are around all the time, that familiarity with a certain person, whether or not you find them to be the most attractive person in the entire world, or there could be some model on TV that you find more attractive and, nicer personality. But the fact that you're exposed to this person and dealing with them all the time, you're more likely to fall in love with that person. And so that's why a lot of times like coworkers hook up and end up getting married, according to this guy. And so I started thinking about that deeper and applying that to 9/11, like I do with different bits of information that I hear. And that might be part of the psychology. I've always wondered with television programs and movies, so many movies, especially coming out now, like V for Vendetta, where the government did the big terror attack and blamed it on some enemy so that they could seize power. And so you think, okay, well, if that was the case, why is that being presented? Now, it might just be very awake writers and producers getting information out to the public. Who knows? Another argument is that maybe if you're more used to seeing something, even if it's not a desirable thing, you're more likely to get used to it. to be more familiar with it and maybe not fall in love with it, but it becomes more normalized to you. Like for instance, if you find I'm gonna be very graphic here, but obviously if you and I saw somebody bite the head off of a chicken right now, if we walked outside and saw that, we'd be very horrified and disgusted, right? But if we had watched YouTube videos of this ahead of time and we had been told stories about it and exposed to it on a constant basis, when we actually see it in real life, we may be a little bit less disgusted. We may just kind of regard it as, yeah, that's what some people do. It's kind of horrified, but what you going to do about it? We might not be as immediately shocked. I don't know. And again, I'm speculating. I don't like to get into other people's heads, but that's an interesting different take that I've had on it now ever since I heard that lecture.
Well, I just wanted to comment on the V for Vendetta part, because it's funny. I think the last time I was on your show, we talked about movies as well. I think we both have that interest. But V for Vendetta, I think is a lot of Hollywood movies show us sort of the underdog, the lone person, the hero fighting against the system. And, we see the system often being portrayed as bad and evil and the whole thing. And I often think that the reason why that's portrayed that way, and is allowed to be portrayed that way, is because it's kind of selling us a myth. And the myth is the idea that one person can fight against everything and completely upset the bad system. And people will go to these movies and they'll watch like V for Vendetta, for example, and they feel a sense of satisfaction that this one hero overcame this tyrannical government. But then they'll go back to their homes and nobody's thinking that situation exists in real life. They're not thinking, well, okay, how can we fight against tyranny? They're just it's like fiction. And I think it's part of this idea that I guess it lends itself to a dramatic portrayal. But the idea that there's the one hero seems to have such a relatively easy time overcoming all these obstacles that it kind of gives us a sense of complacency, I think. That, in other words, the system is embracing the idea that we can overcome the bad guys. And then meanwhile, in real life, we're not even really clear on who the bad guys are a lot of the time. The average person is not necessarily thinking that the U.S. government is the bad guys and the terrorists are kind of held up they're patsies held up to distract us. They're thinking, well, the terrorists are the bad guys and we're the good guys. So.
Well, and I always find it fascinating how in these quote-unquote conspiracy movies, when you have something going on and you have the one or two heroes that are trying to expose a major crime and they're running from the guys in the suits and getting shot at, it always seems to, first of all, it always seems to involve some kind of violence that you got to knock some teeth out in order to get things done, which most people aren't going to do that in real life and aren't going to have the mad Steven Seagal skills to make that happen. That's not a good idea anyway. But also too is that it all comes down to just getting the information to the press. Oh man, we got the microfilmed and this is going to do something right now. Or we got this to this one reporter and now it's blasted out all throughout and we, can have the serene music at the end and it's all over. Like that's how it really works. Like you don't have to agitate just to get some kind of exposure on national TV. I see people may have grown up with these ideas that this is kind of the stuff that you need to do and that you'll talk about this information and people will immediately see the wisdom and the science behind it and want to do something. And that's not how the world really works. Edward Bernays realized this, is that there's a lot of irrational things that go into human decision making. And even if something is not in line with people's better interests, they may go along with it just because of a false sense of security. So I don't know. But it's an interesting question because movies do have a way of shaping people's outlook on certain things. I think that's why they put a lot of effort in making people like us always look crazy. There was one show that actually showed a guy smoking crack while he's talking about 9/11. So, maybe it's just the writer's perception of us, but maybe there's something deeper and more sinister going on. I don't know.
I suspect in some cases, I don't know about that one case, but I suspect there's something more sinister going on, at least in some cases, because it's too much of a pattern. And even in even in movies where you have the kind of crazy conspiracy guy with the tinfoil hat, literally, like Mel Gibson did in Conspiracy Theory, even when they show them turning out to be right at the end of the story, it still kind of puts them in it's still they're still mocked and made fun of, and then the twist, the fictional twist is like, oh, but they're right in this case. But we don't really think that they're likely to be right when we walk out of the theater and we hear somebody talking about a conspiracy outside. We just think it kind of makes a neat movie plot. So yeah, I think there's a definite conditioning going on with movies and TV. And one thing I find really kind of fascinating and disturbing is just how many movies in recent years are dealing with global disasters, end of the world, plagues that wipe out much of humanity. I mean, there's an absurd number of them. In fact, I was even thinking, like, I've made lists of them all, and there were a couple from back 20, 30 years ago that I thought, oh, these ones are looked at this subject, but they're not recent. And one of them was The Stand, Stephen King, that was turned into a miniseries, and the other one was 12 Monkeys from 95, I think, which talks about a plague that wipes out most of humanity. And wouldn't you know that they're remaking The Stand, and 12 Monkeys is now a television show. So, I mean, there are dozens of movies and TV shows that deal with global plagues in the last 5 years. It's very disturbing.
Well, and a lot of stuff too, like History Channel. I've said this on the show before. They put all this effort into presenting themselves as the final authority on what happened on 9/11, and they put on essentially their metaphorical suit and tie and professor glasses to tell everybody that there's nothing to 9/11 and put out this hit piece. But then they go on and they just put on 8 hours of Nostradamus and UFOs and ancient aliens and all this bunk. And I've watched some of these things. I have a friend who's always trying to convince me that there's space saucers and all of this stuff, and she calls me and you got to watch this thing. So I put it on, and right from the beginning, they're putting out all this stuff that is just completely exaggerated, and not just with this program, but other things. I mean, a complete lack of credibility. And again, I'm speculating. I don't like to get into people's heads, but I almost think that they want to put out just a bunch of silly nonsense because they want people chasing that, trying to figure out what Nostradamus' next prophecy is for 2015 and if the world's going to end this year. They want people to be focused on this silliness rather than on the very provable, real stuff that happened on 9/11. I think that they create fake conspiracies to kind of make a mirror maze out of the movement and get people all distracted.
Absolutely. Distract them and also cause fear in some other area, so that we're distracted but made afraid at the same time. Just like you're talking about I guess the 2012, the whole 2012 thing. I mean, that was complete nonsense. The whole will the world end in December 2012. But it sure took the headlines, didn't it?
I always told people, what's going to happen on December 21st, 2012? You're going to get up and it's going to be snowing, or it's going to be snow on the ground, and it's going to be almost Christmas time. The world won't end. And I was right. Who know? Who would have thunk it? I was right.
How did you predict that, though? How did you know?
I must be psychic too. I must be psychic. Now don't edit that out and pretend like I'm saying I'm psychic. I'm kidding, of course. No, I mean, it's just, again, you see people fly off the handle on these silly things, but they don't want to look at these very real and provable things. Now, I want to ask you, while we still have time, just your opinion, because you're a writer, you're a pundit here for 9/11 Freefall. How much do you think politics affects what we do? And I don't mean politics just in the broader sense of geopolitics, but just the nitty-gritty politics. We talk about there being no difference between the two parties and maybe there isn't, other than a management team. But you see the waves being parted now, and there's a very real possibility that we could have Jeb Bush be the next president of the United States. So just from your own view, do you think that would make any difference in our reality now in terms of 9/11 truth and trying to get this message out? Do you think anything would change in that instance, or do you think it would just pretty much flow on the same way it's always flowed?
I really can't see that it would make any difference at all. I mean, could anybody be more of a provide more continuity of the same power structure that's been there for so long than Jeb Bush? And if it's not Jeb Bush, if the Democrats win, it may be Hillary Clinton, and that's hardly a departure either, is it? So, I mean, it's basically the same ruling class. It's just a question of who's going to be up front in front of the camera for the next 4 or 8 years. I can't see. I mean, I'm always afraid that I always try to be careful. Like, I don't want to overstate the idea that, well, it doesn't matter and it's completely meaningless and all that. Because I think people that do follow politics find that really hard to swallow. So, it's the two parties aren't identical. And yes, some things will be different. And so there are some benefits to one party over another, depending on what you believe. But I don't think it'll make any difference at all.
Well, unfortunately, we are out of time. My guest has been Craig Mckee, very funny, very fascinating guy. His website is Truth and Shadows blog. That's truthandshadows.wordpress.com. We're definitely going to have you back on the program. But, Craig, thank you so much for coming on 9/11 Freefall. This program's on every Thursday night on No Lies Radio at 10 o'clock Eastern, 7 o'clock Pacific. You can also download MP3s of this show from the Internet Archive by going to 911freefall.com. This is Andy Steele saying have a great week. Good luck.
The 9/11 Commission, which was tasked with giving us the fullest explanation. No, not one sentence in the 571 pages of the 9/11 Commission report even mentions the destruction of World Trade Center 7. Is this one of the reasons, perhaps, that Senator Max Klingler resigns from the commission, citing it's a national scandal? The investigation is compromised. How about expert corroboration? How about Danny Jawenko, 27-year controlled demolitions expert? It starts from below. They've simply blown away the columns. It's controlled demolition. A team of experts did this. It's professional work, without a doubt. How about Hugo Bachmann, Professor Emeritus, Chairman, Department of Structural Dynamics at Earthquake Engineering, Swiss Federal Institute of Technology? In my opinion, the building, World Trade Center 7, was with great probability professionally demolished. Here's a floor plan of Building 7. Now, to bring a building smoothly, symmetrically into its own footprint without falling over, what we have to do is remove the core columns, because what we want to do is bring the outside of the building in on itself. Now, this involves a high degree of precision that fire is not capable of, being an organic process.